Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Fluency Foundations. My name is Penny Brown. I am an adult education teacher with the Southwest Metro Educational District. That is located in Shakopee, Minnesota, which is a suburb southwest of Minneapolis. Coming to you on a very cold for January, but if you understand Minnesota, you understand that on cold days, we usually get a lot of sun. So I'm happy that we have a lot of sunshine coming in our windows this morning. Our session today is Fluency Foundations. This session is going to address the reading foundational skill in CCRS on reading with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension. Our agenda this morning, where I'm going to respond to some key questions in the field that we normally get regarding fluency. We're going to discuss the ways to create informal assessment to use in your classroom. We're going to review how explicit instruction, what that looks like in a fluency lesson. And then you are going to have some time to observe some classrooms by choosing some different videos that we have available. Okay. I teach what's considered pre-GED, GED classes in our program. Students come into my class when they're reading at about a fourth grade equivalent, and they're with me until they earn their GED or they exit with other goals. We have a mix of native speakers and English language learners. In Shakopee in particular, 15% of our population is foreign-born. So in our classrooms, we have Spanish speakers, we have people from Southeast Asia, we have Russian speakers from both Ukraine and Russia, and a sizable population from East Africa. So not unusual to have someone from 4 different continents in our classrooms at the same time. That gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of where I'm coming from. I see some names that are familiar here, and I see a lot of new names. So I want to get just a feel for where you're at with fluency. So on a scale of 3 to 1, in the chat box, I'd like you to tell me kind of where you're at with using fluency instruction in your classroom. If you have a solid practice, you know a lot of it, you're just coming in today for a brush up, go ahead and put a 3 in there. If you started using fluency instruction for your classroom and you want to go to kind of that deeper level, you want to learn more about it, give me a 2. And if you're new to reading instruction or adult education or haven't used a lot of fluency, go ahead and put 1 in the chat, please. My math students do the same thing. They'll say 2/3 or 2.5 or between a 2 and a 3. I love it. Okay. All right. Okay. We have a good mix here. Wonderful. Okay. Let's go ahead and begin our content for today. So the first question I want to address is why should we bother with fluency in an adult classroom? People who are new to adult education sometimes kind of have a stereotype that fluency is something for little kids and we don't need it for adults. And on this one, I am reluctantly learning AI, and I decided to lean in a little bit and I let AI kind of, I was curious to see what reaction or what response we'd get to that question, and I liked what I saw. So I'm posting it here. I'll give everyone just a moment to read that to themselves. I highlighted the words shifting the cognitive energy from decoding words to understanding the text. That's a very sophisticated way of kind of how I explain fluency to my students. And I think that really is the gist of why fluency instruction is important for adult learners. It's to give them the skills so the majority of their time is spent thinking about what the words mean. Okay. As we go through today, please feel free to chat questions. I do have a few slides where I'm going to stop for people to think and have questions, but if other things pop up along the way, go ahead. In the chat box, could I, looking at this, is there anything else that kind of sticks out with you? Any reactions to our AI summary of why fluency is important? If you could give me a short comment in the chat box. Mm-hmm. From the decoding to understanding, mental space, meaning making, the independent learning I'm seeing. Okay. All right. So there's some phrases there that are resonating with you. Yes, Rachel, the greater comprehension, shifting energy. Okay. To think higher. Yeah. Okay. I think we're agreeing with the AI on this example. The next question I want to review is the components of fluency. In fluency, there's 3 skills that we're helping our students develop at the same time. The first skill is commonly referred to as accuracy. This is the decoding process of reading. This is that process in which the students are bringing the words into their brain, so they kind of almost hear the words in their mind. And building the skills so that process happens automatically, okay, without a lot of effort. When a student encounters a new word, they're able to get it off the page without a lot of hesitation, without having to do a lot of extra pausing when they read aloud. When we refer to rate, it's a little bit different than speed. And I know when I worked in special ed and I worked in a program that focused on word count, we tended to go astray and we focused a little bit more on speed rather than rate. Rate is reading at a pace that maximizes comprehension, okay? If a student reads too slowly, if it's laborious, if it's word by word, most of their mental energy is focusing on the decoding, and that's going to interfere with their ability to understand what they read. But I've also, over the years, witnessed situations where students read too fast, okay? They're focused so much on the speed at which they read that they're not taking any pauses to think about the meaning, okay? And they can whip through an entire paragraph, an entire page, but by the end of the page, they can't tell me anything about what they read, okay? So reading too fast also interferes with comprehension. So I think of rate as finding that medium pace that maximizes their ability to understand what they're reading. The third component was one that I found a bit confusing when I first was introduced to the concept of prosody. I think the first time that I kind of heard that term, I walked away assuming it was the same thing as reading with expression. And it really isn't. It's taken me a few years to kind of delineate that. Prosody is reading in meaningful phrases. So it's the not reading a word at a time. It's recognizing punctuation marks, which are there, okay, to phrase things. But when we get into more advanced text, we also need to create phrases beyond what's delineated by punctuation marks. Okay. When a student is reading in meaningful phrases, it is an indication they're comprehending the text. And it also helps them comprehend the text. It works both directions. Okay. Expression is the vocal dynamics of reading that becomes very important if you're training actors or performers or that kind of thing. It's the idea that when you come to the end of a sentence with a question, you raise your voice. certain words, if they're in italics, they should maybe be emphasized more. The vocal dynamics of like reading some at a higher volume or lower volume, that's all expression. It's good stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't want to like dissuade people from reading with expression, but it's a nice bonus. Okay, it's not the same as prosody. Reading with prosody means you're understanding the text. A person can read completely monotone and still have good prosody and still understand the text. I worked with one gentleman several years ago who, in his reading development, I think understood that your voice should modulate and you should have all those different inflections in your voice. And he read with great expression, but he didn't read with prosody. There was no logic to the point where he would change his voice. It's almost like every 5 words he decided to raise his voice or lower his voice. So I have seen a student who actually reads with a lot of expression but doesn't have any prosody. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute just to see. I'm seeing a couple of things pop up in chat here. Let's see if I've got anything. Yeah, chunking is a good way to describe prosody, as long as the chunking is connected to meaning, right? That you're chunking the words in a way that makes sense, that helps somebody understand the meaning of the words. Okay. Okay. All right. So accuracy, rate, and prosody are the 3 skills that we are developing kind of simultaneously in fluency lessons. Who needs fluency instruction? So this is coming from links. We can assume that an adult reader who is at the beginning stages of reading, if they're working on phonics, even if they're working in some of the syllabication, that kind of thing, they're most likely going to need fluency because they need an opportunity to apply their phonics knowledge with real text. Okay. So if you're working with a kind of a beginning ELL student or a native speaker who is reading like below probably a 3rd grade equivalent, you can assume that fluency is going to be a need, okay? But intermediate readers also need fluency, and I'm even going to say that I still think there's a point, there's a purpose to doing fluency with high school readers, okay? Intermediate readers, however, are the ones that are most vulnerable because they tend to get lost in the shuffle. Because an intermediate reader might do pretty well on a silent reading test, especially if it's something they have background knowledge in and that kind of thing. But when they're presented with a different type of text, their comprehension can look drastically different. And then when you have them read aloud, you understand that, oh, there isn't the prosody there that we should have. Or there's certain phonics skills, like they have phonics in general, but there's certain skills that that is becoming problematic in that it's interfering with their ability to understand what they're reading. Okay. As a person who works with a lot of GED prep students, I also think there's a benefit in doing fluency with somebody who's reading at a 9th grade level or higher, because our GED or high school equivalency students have to take a timed test, okay? And the fluency helps build the skills and the confidence, okay, to be able to negotiate a test when there's a time limit on it. So I'm not going to say that there's a point where students don't need fluency, but I think the level of text and what you focus on can look different depending on a student's overall reading level. Okay, I'm just going to check my chat here. Yeah, okay. Yep, Christine is echoing the idea that a GED prep student can also benefit from fluency because that can be what the obstacle is with a time test. They're actually answering questions very well. They're just not answering enough of them in the time limit that's given. Yeah. Yes, Karen, I would agree that the purpose of the text, a person's fluency and ability to comprehend it does vary um, by the type of text. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Okay, so I'm going to get into now a little bit more of an informal assessment of what to do when students are coming to you, maybe entering your classroom. How to kind of determine what would be the appropriate range of text for them to be working on in their fluency practice. If you were trained as an elementary teacher, or if you worked in special ed in a K-12 program, you may have, or honestly, even with STAR, back in the day with STAR, you may have been trained to use formal assessments. And I'm going to encourage you to think about the idea of it might be more efficient for you to work with informal assessment, okay? I'm thinking back to the days when I worked in special ed, and a fluency assessment would involve a teacher like noting the text to the point where almost every word on that text had notes on it. And there was a purpose for that. There was a purpose for that with the elementary students, because I think sometimes in elementary, the technique that they use for fluency might change depending on the errors. In elementary ed, those special ed teachers also have to write pretty lengthy assessment summary reports and having very detailed reports about like error analysis. There was a purpose for that. I'm not sure that is necessary with adult ed. So one way that you can assess fluency is you can look at the materials that you use for fluency instruction in class. And you take some selections from those materials. I like that because the assessment, the materials I'm using to assess my students are closely aligned with the materials that we're using for comprehension and other activities in class. So if you use Common Lit, which already has, kind of level text, you can pick some selections, okay, from Common Lit, and then you're using the actual materials to help place them in the appropriate area for the curriculum. Informal assessment also allows you to use a variety of text, okay? So if you're teaching beginning ELL, it might make more sense for you to be assessing fluency using texts that are focused on life skills, right? Where if you're teaching more of a GED prep, you might want to test fluency more off of some science or social studies content. So it helps you tailor the type of text for the audience that you're working with. With an informal assessment, I would encourage you to avoid the word counting, figuring out how many words per minute a student is reading. The norms about what's appropriate, like an appropriate reading rate for adults, vary according to the complexity and the purpose of the text. And the word count programs do have a tendency, when students get very focused on word count, they get focused on speed rather than prosody or finding that nice medium pace. They erroneously think that good reading is fast reading. And that actually works against us, our purpose. I know in some of the special ed and the K-12 assessments, they would do very detailed, they would mark all of the different types of errors, like a student repeated a word 3 times and they skipped a word 5 times and they missed an ending 7 times and that type of thing. And I remember asking my previous administrator, who was from K-12, I said, so if a student is making more skips than repetitions, does that change the way you instruct them? And she kind of said yes, but she wasn't able to really, she wasn't able to go further with that. In adult education, the ways that we use for fluency instruction, it kind of addresses everything. So I don't see a need to go into a really detailed assessment of the type of errors, okay? To me, the purpose of assessment as a teacher is to inform my instruction. And if I can get what I need from a more holistic thing that makes me more efficient, I'm going to go that route. Okay. When we're looking for Fluency 2, we're not a K-12 system, so I don't think that we have to drill down to this person is reading at a 4.5 grade point average. I think you want ranges, okay? They're reading below, around a third grade or lower, they probably have needs for phonics, okay? They're on the lower end of the intermediate spectrum, the upper end of the intermediate spectrum, or they're at kind of that high school level. I think finding ranges is more efficient than trying to drill down to a specific grade equivalent. So this is kind of the method that I've been using, and it's somewhat based on the rubric from STAR, okay? But when you assess fluency, you need to work one-on-one with the student, and they have to read aloud. Okay, that's really the only way for you to judge how their brain is processing the text is to hear them read aloud. Usually 2 to 3 paragraphs is enough for you to have an idea of how they're doing at that level. You're looking for a point where the fluency is beginning to break down. And there's usually 2 points. There's one point where they're still decoding words pretty accurately, but it's getting choppy. They're having to take some breaks to decode, okay? They're maybe not reading in meaningful phrases, or they're reading in very short phrases. And then there's a second point where the decoding error really starts to come into play, okay? Where getting the words off the page are becoming more laborious. They have to take breaks to sound out that word. They might not be accurate getting it off the page. So you're kind of looking for places where the fluency begins to break down, okay? So if you think of a 3-2-1 scale, or like the stoplight colors, it can give you a more holistic way to look at things. The fluent readers will pronounce most words accurately, not all of them. Fluency does not mean perfection, okay? But they're getting most of the words accurate. And they decode most words with automaticity. They don't have to stop to decode it. It comes off as they encounter it in the text without any additional breaks. The student reads at a smooth and a steady pace that is kind of a medium range, that not too fast, not too slow. They can pause at appropriate punctuation marks. They self-correct errors. So a fluent student who mispronounces a word or who breaks a phrase in a place where it doesn't make sense for the text should go back. They'll go back, they'll recognize it isn't making sense, and they'll pronounce the word differently or break the phrase differently, okay? That is a sign of a fluent reader because they're comprehending what they read. And they're reading in phrases that suggest that they're understanding what they're reading. In contrast, a partially fluent reader is still producing most words accurately, but they may start to stall a little bit when they hit an unknown word. They may read at a pace that is too fast or too slow to really aid comprehension. They might rush past those punctuation marks. They might not self-correct an error, or they might read in phrases, short phrases, word by word. They sound really choppy when they read. And a person at that kind of one level who really isn't fluent at all are pronouncing quite a few words inaccurately. The decoding is laborious. It's a word for word reading, and it takes a lot of mental effort for them to get a word off the page. They're not likely to read at a steady pace. They pause more than is necessary. They may not recognize when they've made a mistake and self-correct. And they may read in phrases, but they're very short phrases, maybe 2 or 3 words at a time. Okay. Do questions on those definitions before we move on? I'm going to give you an opportunity to practice then. So you're going to need some scratch paper kind of at home. I have enlisted my students to help. I told them I'm going to be presenting, and they graciously agreed to let me record them. I'm going to play 4 samples for you, and I would like you to kind of pretend that you're evaluating them. And would you place them at a 3, a 2, or a 1? Okay. I do encourage people when you are evaluating fluency is to take your eyes off the text. You should be familiar with the text ahead of time, like read it ahead of time so you know what it is. But I have found that when I'm evaluating fluency and the text is in front of me, my ears tend to hear what I think the words should be rather than always hearing exactly what the student is saying. When I take my eyes off the text and I'm just listening, I feel like I get a more accurate read on their fluency because my brain as an evaluator is focused on listening to them read, and it's not self-correcting because I'm seeing the text in front of me. All right. I'm just checking here. Stephen, I see you have a question. How much is tied to fluency in level 1? Are you referring to level 1 of ELL learners?
No, it's not level 1. I have level 4 readers that are not fluent. That somehow their listening, speaking skills are quite good, but they really stumble over almost every word. And I'm just curious in their first language if maybe they're not fluent readers there.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So with ELL in general, a person who is more fluent in their primary language will probably make faster gains in fluency as they're reading another language. Um, if they're stumbling a lot, even if they're at level 4, and to me, every program level 4 can mean something different, so it doesn't help a whole lot. But if somebody is stumbling a lot, and they're whether they're ELL learners or not, I would dig into phonics a little bit. I would look at a Sylvia Green assessment, or I would look at I really like the old mega words. It's been around for a long time, but it's a curriculum that addresses how to create the syllables in words, and maybe doing a little informal assessment to see how they decode words in isolation.
Hmm.
Um, and then if they're not decoding the words in isolation very well, I think that's an indication to add in some more alphabetics instruction.
Hmm.
Um, because they need to have those skills in isolation to be able to have something to apply to text. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Did I address your question correctly? Or
Yes, and yeah, level 4, I think that there's a broad swath of definition there. So thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, so it's time for you all to practice a little bit. So, a couple months ago, we were reading A Long Walk to Water. If you're not familiar with it, it is a delightful book by Linda Sue Park. It is based on the true story of a man named Salva Dut, who was a one of the lost boys of Sudan, who eventually immigrates to the United States, and then as an adult goes back to the Sudan to build wells for his family. And it also tells the story of a little girl named Naya who has to walk to get water every day. And by the end of the story, she's able to go to school because they built a well in her home. So that's the text they're reading from. I'm going to play sample A, and then I'll play all 4 samples, and then I'm going to ask you in chat to kind of tell me how you would evaluate them on the 3, 2, 1 scale. Okay, let me be sure my sound is up. If you do not hear it, I'm going to bring the sound on my computer up. Hold on, as high as I can here. Let me just double check. If you're having a hard time hearing things, I'm going to need you then to adjust the volume on your device. Okay, got that. Get back here. Christine, give me a thumbs up if you hear it, okay?
The Lost Boys, that was what they were being called in America. The boys who had lost their homes and families because of the war and had wandered lost for weeks or months at a time before reaching the refugee camps. The aid worker explained this to Selva and the 8 other boys he would be traveling with. The woman spoke mostly English. Sometimes she said a word or two in Arabic, but she did not speak that language well. She tried her best to speak slowly, but she had many things to tell them, and Selva worried that he might misunderstand something important. They rode in a truck from the Ifo refugee camp to a processing center in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. Endless forms had to be filled out. Their photos were taken. There was a medical examination. It was all a blur to Selva, for he was too excited to sleep, which made him too tired to grasp everything that was happening. But there was one clear moment when he was given new clothes. In the camp, he had worn an old pair of shorts and had even older t-shirt. He had taken as good care of them as he could, but there were holes in the shirt and the waistband of the shorts was stretched out and threadbare.
Okay, I think we have enough on that one. So on a sheet of scrap paper, evaluate sample A. Is the student reading at a 3, a 2, or a 1? Here is sample B.
They were smiling and waving in the airport lobby. His new family. Chris, the father, Louis, the mother, and 4 children. Salva would have siblings. They just as he had before. He felt his shoulders relax a little on seeing their anger smiles. Sava said hello and thank you many times, for in his figure and confused. There were the only words he felt sure about. He could not understand what anyone was saying, especially Louis, who spoke so quickly that at first he was not sure she was even speaking English. And yes, they did have more clothes for him.
Okay. So I think that's enough. On a sheet of scratch paper, go ahead and jot down with sample B. Would you evaluate that person at a 3, a 2, or a 1? Here is sample C.
Salva could hardly believe his eyes when he boarded the plane in Nairobi. Every person had a seat, and they all had luggage too. With all those people, hundreds of heavy padded chairs, and all those bags, how would the plane ever get off the ground? Somehow it did, not like a bird lifting off lightly with a quick flapping of wings, but with shrieks and roars from the engines as the plane lumbered down the long runway, as if it had to try as hard as it could to get into the air. Once the plane was safely aloft, Salva stared at the scene outside the small window. The world was so big, yet everything in it was so small. Huge forests and deserts became mere patches of green and brown. Cars crawled along the roads like ants in a line. And there were people down there, thousands of them, but he could not see a single one. Would you like a drink? Salva looked up at the woman in her neat uniform and shook his head to show that he did not understand. She smiled. Coca-Cola? Orange juice? Coca-Cola. Long ago, Salva's father had once brought a few bottles of Coca-Cola back from his trip to the market. Salva's first taste had been startling, all those bubbles jumping around in his mouth. What a rare treat it had been. Coca-Cola, thank you, Salva said. And with each sip, he remembered his family passing the bottles from hand to hand, laughing at the tickly bubbles, sharing and laughing together.
Okay. On your paper, jot down how you would evaluate sample 3, or sample C at a 3, 2, 1. Okay. And then sample D is a ELL learner. So go ahead and try this one.
The journey to Silver new home required not 1, not 2, but 3 planes. The first plane flew from Nairobi to Frankfurt in a country called Germany. It landed with an alarming thump, then braked so hard that Silver was thrown forward in his seat. The strap across his stomach caught him hard. He took a second plane from Frankfurt to New York City. It, too, landed abruptly, but this time Silver was ready, and he held tightly to the armrest. The New York City, the aide worker led the boy to different gates. Some would be making the final legs of their trip along, while others were in group of 2 or 3. Silver was the only one going to Rochester. The aide worker said that his new family would be waiting for him there. On the plane to Rochester, most of the passengers were men traveling on their own, but there were some women too, and a few families, mother and father and children. Most of the people were white. Beginning at the airport in Frankfurt, Silver had seen more white people in the last few hours than he had seen before in his whole lifetime. He tried not to stare, but he couldn't help studying the families closely. Thoughts kept looping through his mind. What if my new family isn't there? What if they had changed their minds? What if they meet me and don't like me? Silver took a deep breath, a step at a time. He reminded himself, just this flight to get through for now.
Okay. And your paper, you can jot down how you would evaluate student D. And then in the chat box, what I'd like you to do is just list A and what number. So like A1, B2, however you evaluated the 4, just drop your results in the chat box for me. right. Okay, I see a lot of results coming in. So I'll explain how I evaluated them. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right or wrong, because everybody kind of has a different point of view. And sometimes the difference between a 2 and a 3 and a 2 and a 1 can be a little bit subjective. So it doesn't mean that we all have to have an identical, okay? My first student I evaluated as a 2. He started out pretty choppy word for word, but then as he got going, he got more fluent. He started to group things and get into more of a steady pace. He pronounced most words correctly. He struggled with Nairobi, but I would expect most people would if they are not familiar, okay, with Africa. So I placed him at a 2. I think he still needs work at this level, or perhaps a level that is a little bit higher. Okay. Sample B, I placed as a 1. The majority of her mental power when she was reading aloud was devoted to getting the word off the page. Okay. I was hearing a lot of word by word reading, or like sometimes she'd read in a phrase of 2 or 3 words. When she came to words that were familiar, it's kind of stopped her in her tracks, right? She really had to stop and try for several seconds to get the word off that page. Sample C, I did mark as 3 as a fluent reader. I would put a little note there, saying, if anything, he might be reading just a tad too fast. I would kind of comment with him. I would say, when you read, be sure that you're taking some pauses at the punctuation marks, to be sure that your brain has time to think about what the words mean. Okay. It can get a little more challenging to evaluate fluency with ELL learners. The rule of thumb that I use is the error or the trouble with the fluency going to impact their understanding of the text. Okay. So our student here, a student D, I placed it 2. She is originally from Vietnam and still has, a pretty noticeable accent in her speaking English. The Vietnamese language is very staccato. There's not a lot of long sounds. And so even when she's making an effort to pronounce the long sounds in English, it has a tendency to come off with a bit of an accent, like shorter than what we would expect. However, her mispronunciations are not affecting her ability to understand the text in class, if that makes sense. So for fluency, she needs to work on it at this level or a little bit higher. Within the fluency lesson, I can help tweak pronunciation, but her pronunciation seems to be more a result of an accent of a first language than it does not being able to decode a word or get a word off of a page. And that's kind of the general rule that I use with that. Questions about evaluating fluency? For those of you who are using fluency assessment in your practice, do you have any other tips that have worked well for you, or obstacles that you've run into? Stephen, can an accent be changed in a significant way? I'm not the person to answer that. I am not an ELL teacher. I think it can be improved upon, but my ELL colleagues have described there is a process of something called fossilization, where a person's language development has kind of gone as far as it's going to go. I don't understand the research behind that. I do tell my students that I never want them to completely get rid of their accent, even if that's their goal, because the accent is part of who they are, okay? I want them to be able to communicate clearly if they're making phone calls and that kind of thing. I want them to be understood. But like with my Vietnamese student and Cambodian students, they often tend to drop the S or not have the S sound at the end of words. Okay, I'm not going to spend, I'm not going to revisit that every single day, every time they make that mistake. I'll address it once in a while. Definitely. Yeah, Karen. I'm told that we Minnesotans have quite an accent. I've never heard it. But you're right. The way somebody pronounces a word does sound a little bit different in Texas than it does in Minnesota. And so when we're evaluating fluency, if we're working from people out of state, that's something we need to keep in mind as well. Christine, do you have any questions or any feedback on Stephen's question about changing accents in a significant way?
Oh my goodness. I think there are a lot of factors. I know that it's always age can sometimes be a factor. Often when people immigrate to the US when they're young. I've taught, many high school students who have no trace of an accent. But age isn't a defining factor. I think that sometimes it can be the home language and the different sounds, how different the sounds are. We have sounds obviously in English that some languages don't have. That can be a little bit tougher. I'm sure there's a very complex answer to this question, and I know that accent reduction is a thing, and accent reduction, there's some good things about it and some not so good things about accent reduction. And I think the frustration comes from it is a part of who they are, and we embrace that, right? But unfortunately, our students also come in contact with people who are not so kind. And are not so kind in terms of I can't understand you. And that's something that I used to talk to my students about. So this would be, probably a great Patsy question.
I would agree. There's a difference between having an accent and then not being understood, right? Those are two very different things. And obviously, we want our students to be understood. Okay, with that. Okay, I'm just checking. We have some ELL teacher. Mara is chiming in. As a bridge to being understood. I like that, Mara. Thank you very much. Fluency is a bridge to being understood, but not necessarily like completely eliminating an accent. Yeah. Yeah. I think the point I'm trying to make is in your fluency lesson, you're really building the skills so that the majority of the mental power is on comprehension. So just if you're an ELL teacher and you want to address the accent, or if you're a GED teacher, okay, and I do to address the accent or that, please do. Just don't let it take over the lesson, right? And to have your fluency lesson all of a sudden become a pronunciation lesson, it's, I think, important to find the balance there. Yeah, Betsy could answer that question as well at length, I'm sure. Yeah. Okay, all right, let's move on. I think we just covered questions about informal fluency, key questions, so we're going to move past that slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, now I've assessed, I know what my students need and kind of a general range of text level that they should be practicing. How do I incorporate instruction? Well, there's kind of two models. In the standalone model, fluency is sort of its own component. A teacher might work one-on-one. They might work with a small group. They might have a couple small groups that they switch between. They might do fluency with the entire class. Fluency can also be embedded into another portion of your class. So if you're going to be doing a comprehension lesson on a piece of science text, you could take the first few paragraphs of that science text and use that as the text for your fluency. The vocabulary series that I use has a lengthy paragraph, or actually about a half a page article where the students fill in the words. Once we filled in the vocabulary words, then we use that text as part of the fluency practice. Okay, So there's ways to embed it into what you're already doing instead of having to, plan an entirely new component. Natalie, I use good question. I got to find the title. Hold on. I use a book, a series from Townsend Press that was published by Eliza, is it Comadromus, I think is the way her name is pronounced. This is used at Normandale Community College, or at least it was at one point in their the pre-college classes. I forgot what they're called. Anyhow, the pre-college reading classes. And so since my students are kind of GED prep and college prep, I use that one. If you are working with ELL or more intermediate readers, I would recommend Words to Learn By. I think if I remember right, Words to Learn By also has has some text built into it that could be used for fluency after vocabulary. Okay. So explicit instruction is the method that we want to use, but it looks different in fluency than it might in a comprehension or vocabulary, because in a fluency lesson, we might bounce back and forth between a few of these stages, okay? The explanation in fluency is mostly about building an idea of why fluency is important and how this will help students get to their other goals. I also, in my explanation, discuss accuracy rate and prosody. In a fluency lesson, there should be a high degree of modeling. I mean, up to 50% of the time, a teacher or a fluent volunteer or a recorded sound should be reading. Okay, students need to hear what fluent reading sounds like in order to duplicate it. If you think about ice skating, and if a person is always showing the steps of, I don't know, what is it, triple axel, something like that, they're always showing the steps and it's always scaffold and it's that, but they never see what a triple axel looks like, right? They're never going to really reach what you're aiming for. So the modeling is very important. Guided practice is where students are reading and then you, the teacher, are there listening with them, offering some feedback. Independent practice, you might be stepping away and maybe they're reading with a partner or they're doing some like reading with a recording. And then this, I have to admit, as a practitioner, I'm not always great at this, but the monitoring and feedback, okay, when I'm on the top of my game, having a really good day, at the end of once a student has read, I try to give them one positive piece of feedback and one suggestions for improvement. But I have to admit, I don't do that every day. I need to get better on that process. I know in STAR training, people often ask me for my explanation statement. So this is how I would introduce a fluency lesson when I have a new student in my class, okay? I'm not going to do this every single day because it's too repetitive, but when a new student has joined us or I'm having, an administrator observe me, I'll discuss this. When we read, our mind is doing two things at once. Thinking about how the words sound and thinking about what the words mean. Fluency practice helps us train our brains to use most of our thinking energy on understanding the meaning of what we read. By reading aloud, we're practicing accuracy, pronouncing words, rate, a steady medium pace, and prosody, grouping words into meaningful phrases. So that's an example of how I might introduce a fluency lesson. Techniques that we recommend for adults are similar to, but not always identical to what they would recommend in K-12. Echo reading is where the teacher reads a phrase and the students read right after, and you go through the whole text with that echoing. Echoing works best with small groups or one-on-one, and this is the highest support that you can provide a student in a lesson. So echo reading is very helpful with prosody, with the rate, but also if decoding is coming into an issue. Collaborative oral reading is where students read from a common text, often fiction, but it doesn't have to be fiction, but they take turns reading, with a fluent reader reading about half of the time. In marked phrase boundaries, this works really well for students who decode well, but they're choppy or they're not phrasing very well. In this, the teacher will make slashes, okay, at the places where they should take breaks. Repeated reading is where a student will read the text multiple times, and then you can also combine techniques. So at this point in time, oh, I'm sorry, got one more slide. In a minute, we're going to give you some time to virtually visit some classrooms and to watch some videos of fluency lessons. As you're watching those videos, I want you to think about, as an instructor, how many groups, okay, is the teacher maybe managing? How much of the class time, okay? So we recommend either 1 to 2 groups for fluency, about 10 to 20 minutes. So it doesn't have to be the majority of your lesson. It's just a component. Think about what prep work is required before the lesson, and then what is the teacher's role during the lesson? Is the teacher remembering to provide feedback? And then what would this work in my circumstances? Why or why not? So Christine is going to drop those questions into chat for us. And then she's going to drop these links. Okay, we have 4 choices, and we're going to let you kind of self-direct. We have a video of echo reading from me, a much younger. This has got to be at least 10 years old by now. Lesson of echo reading with a small group of students. We have a video of Tina Cush doing collaborative oral reading with a volunteer and then the other students in the class. Brenda Hackbarth is demonstrating repeated reading, where students are reading using the reading skills for today's adults program and iPads. Brenda had about 20 students in her room, so it wasn't feasible for her to break into 2 groups or that kind of thing. So the repeated reading was a way for her to manage those large numbers. And then last week, I convinced my students to let me film them. And we have a lesson of mixed techniques that is done via Zoom. So in this lesson, all of the students are online. I'm combining marked phrase boundaries, echo reading, and then repeated reading. So you can kind of see what that would look like online. So I'm going to give you, let's see, we're 10 for maybe 8 to 10 minutes to kind of choose which ones you want to look at. The mixed text, you don't have to watch the whole 12 minutes, okay? You can watch what is important for you. And then we're going to come back and address some final comments and final questions, okay? Does anybody have any questions about the directions for our next step? Okay, I'm just checking. Okay, I believe those links are in chat now, so you have time to go ahead and be sure you're on mute and you have time to observe some lessons on your own. We have about 6 minutes left, so I want to wrap things up. I do get questions from time to time about how to give feedback. So on this kind of last slide, I gave some examples. I try to aim, when I'm giving feedback to students, give them 1 or 2 relative strengths and then 1 kind of specific thing to work on in the future. So I have some sample comments that you can read there. And as you're reading through those, any questions or ideas or feedback that you have from the videos that you watched or anything else on this presentation, this is our opportunity to address any other questions that you might have come up.
Can I chime in for a second, Penny?
Oh, of course.
I always learn from you. I've got a whole thing of notes here from you. Um, just as a reminder to folks that we have the Teaching Reading to Adults Canvas course. There is a section on assessing fluency and then a whole module on strategies for teaching fluency. And Penny, some of her slides are in there. Penny was one of the people who reviewed the original course, so she was able to give her 2 cents. And you do not have to take the whole course. You can go in and you can pick through the modules that most interest you, and that's absolutely fine. And as a reminder, Andrea Eckelberger added an entire module about evidence-based reading instruction and assessment for beginning literacy learners. So I just invite you to enroll, and again, just go to what you want, what you're most interested in. Yeah, so thank you so much, Penny.
Okay. As we finish up here, what I'm going to ask is if you in the chat box, if you can put one thing from the presentation that was helpful or something you have questions about or something you'd like to learn more about. It isn't really feedback from my ego. It's more to so we have some data and information to plan like professional development in the future. So if there's something here that you'd like to go a deeper dive into it or that kind of thing, any kind of comments like that in the chat box would be appreciated. Otherwise, you can head out and get ready for, I think we have a break now. Is that correct, Christine?
Yes, we have a break here. I'm going to put this in the chat box for everyone's ease here. 11:15, and the flyer is there, so you can get yourself ready for the next session.
All right, and that's all I have then. Thank you, everybody.